As most of you know by now, I'm taking a class at McLennan Community College. I had my doubts about going back to school and taking a college course. I'm good at absorbing information, but sometimes not so good when it comes to expressing that information in a way that the teacher wants. In other words, I'm really lousy when it comes to taking tests. True-false tests drive me crazy. I've lived long enough on this earth to realize that there are very few absolutes. And so instead of seeing things as true or false, or as black or white, I tend to see the gray areas, which makes true-false tests very difficult for me, as well as multiple choice tests. And for that matter, fill-in-the-blank tests give me headaches. So wouldn't you know, all my test questions are matching and fill in the blank with only an occasional short answer, which I always manage to transform into a half-page essay. But I must be getting the hang of things because I did pretty good on last week's midterm. A test of 100 matching and multiple choice questions. In this morning's and next week's tests, Jesus is also being tested. In fact, it might even be considered his final exam. For it's partly because of his brilliant theological responses to the religious authorities, his outmaneuvering them in their own game, that his doom is ultimately sealed. In this morning's text, they tested him by putting forth a question which demanded a yes or no answer. Because they had grown accustomed to living in a world that could be divided into things like ally or enemy and saint or sinner, they thought it only natural to ask a yes or no question. And depending upon his response, Jesus was in danger of either losing his following or his life, either of which would have been satisfactory for the authorities. You see, if he answered yes, it's lawful to pay taxes to the emperor, his popularity with the people would fall away. And if he answered no, it's not lawful to pay taxes to the emperor, the Roman government would move in on him as a political agitator. But Jesus was much better at taking tests than I ever hoped to be. You see, he refused to fall into the trap of thinking that we either live a spiritual life or a worldly life. He recognized that we don't choose between the two, but rather live in tension between God and the reality of our existence in this world. This is the stuff of faithfulness. When challenged by his adversaries, Jesus told them to pull out a denarius, the coin which was used for paying taxes. And in their readiness for a debate, they hastily reached into their pockets and drew out the requested coin, a coin which would have had an image of Caesar on it, as well as an inscription proclaiming him as the son of the divine Augustus, something blatantly offensive to many of the Jews. You see, not all coins had images of Caesar on them. Out of respect for Jewish law, coins minted by Herod the Great and his son, Herod Antipas, did not. And many devout Jews avoided using coins with images. So when Jesus exposes our friends for carrying around these graven images in their pockets, it's the first of a 1-2 punch which he delivers to his adversaries. The second punch is when he tells them to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. The word render means give back. So far as the first half of the statement goes, we can imagine Jesus saying with a dismissive shrug, It's Caesar's coin. Go ahead and give it back to him. But when the second half is added, it's as if he is saying, give to God what bears the stamp of God's image on it. And if we understand that to be ourselves, that we are made in God's image, then that means we are to give to God our whole selves. His answer is not as much of a black and white, open and shut case as his opponents had been hoping for. Our lives are lived out somewhere in between black and white. We spend most of them in multiple shades of gray. The issue for Jesus is not to pay taxes or not to pay taxes, any more than that is the issue for us today. Dan Clendenin writes, paying your taxes is simple. However distasteful, you hold your nose and write a check. Civilization is expensive, and taxes pay the tab. But absolute allegiance to an ultimate God, rendering our entire selves to God without preconditions or limits, without hedging our bets, demands a higher order of magnitude. That takes a lifetime. The question is not whether or not to pay taxes. The question is the one posed by biblical scholar Marcus Borg. What belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar? And what if Caesar is Hitler or apartheid or communism or global capitalism? In other words, what happens when the boundaries of our spiritual values cross over onto our worldly obligations and even conflict with them? Well, as I have said in different ways this morning, there is no rule book with an absolute answer. And to try to choose one absolute answer over another is to fall into a trap which Jesus managed to escape in this morning's text. The people who questioned Jesus were looking for a rule book with the answers buried inside it, a book that provided solutions to everyday situations. Jesus indicated there was no such book, and there still isn't. We simply muddle through life the best we know how, living within the tension of worldly values and spiritual values, calling the shots as we see them and as God's Spirit has given us guidance. If you're looking for me to give you an answer about what is right and what is wrong, you're going to leave this morning's sermon disappointed. If you want someone to spell out what it means to give your life over to God, you'll have to go somewhere else because I'm unable to do so. The best I can do is to point you to Jesus' response next week to another question which appeared on his final exam. His answer was, love God and love your neighbor. When things get confusing for me, when I don't know what I'm supposed to do, when I am trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong, the best question I can ask myself is my response loving? Does my behavior lift up my neighbors, or does it shame them? Are my words life-giving, or are they divisive? If we are expected to give back to God what is God's, then the only task before us is whether or not our lives are being lived out in a loving way. You see, God has given us love. extravagant, radical, boundless love. And if we are to give back to God what is God's, then we are called to that same sort of love. That same extravagant, radical, boundless love which we have been so fortunate to receive. If we can manage to do that, then we don't have to worry. We will have passed the final exam with flying colors. May it be so in your life and in mine.